The History Channel has been known for a lot of things during its lifetime, such as documentaries about who offed King Tut, countless series on World War II, and even a collection of things that are nonsense, but historical and interesting nonetheless, such as Nostradamus specials. Alas, that era of rich, arguably never-ending historical content seems to have become as ancient and extinct as some of the topics that the channel once covered, with new series only tentatively related to history taking their stead. Despite this sharp departure from the channel's past, the shows that it produces are still a ton of fun and rather enjoyable. And that goes doubly for the extremely popular porn stars. Rick Harrison, the star, is a bona fide historical expert, and his immense knowledge on just about everything gives great insight and credibility into a show that's really about watching weird people make wild deals over crazy items. And with a show as popular as this one, there are lots of weird people, wild deals, and crazy items. With our list of 4 sellers who regretted being on Porn Stars, and 16 who loved it, we're chronicling some of the people who giddily appeared on the beloved and far-reaching series, along with whether they had a blast or the exact opposite. While we obviously can't say that we're Rick Harrison, we can still reasonably say that you never know what's going to come through that door. Well, except in this case, where you know that it's going to be a collection of sellers who regretted being on Porn Stars coupled with 16 folks who did. Isaac Newton is one of history's most important figures, not to mention one of science's most integral godfathers too. Famous for many things, but chiefly his discovery of gravity. Anything that was directly touched by this famous person is practically priceless, and rightfully so. A seller had a feeling that this was the case, and they brought the pawn shop a book that came directly from Isaac Newton's personal library. While such a lofty claim could be cause for concern regarding authenticity, the shop had a buddy verify the item, valuing it at $20,000. In typical fashion, the old man gave the seller an absurdly low price, and the two haggled until they reached $7,000. The deal was made, and while $7,000 isn't exactly a small amount, the seller no doubt regrets being pressured into this insulting deal in front of millions of viewers. In all fairness, the subject of this entry isn't someone who was actually on Pawn Stars per se. Rather, they ripped off the Pawn Stars gang before they were famous worldwide. That said, we decided to include them on this list since they've no doubt enjoyed telling their friends and family that they utterly scammed the now famous shop and its owners. So what did they do? Sold fake Rolexes. That seems like the oldest trick in the book, doesn't it? Well, it kind of is, except it happened to Corey before he knew more about identifying fakes and when supposed sellers aren't being truthful. Perhaps this incident is the reason why Corey seems to be in a perpetually foul mood in every last episode of the series. Rick is infamous for calling in a buddy for just about everything. So infamous, in fact, that it's become a full-fledged meme. That said, authenticity is a major factor in having a successful business in this particular industry, so we can't blame him. We can blame him, however, for not calling in an expert when he clearly needed one. A seller brought in a supposed 19th century Wells Fargo strongbox and walked out with $450 cash in their pocket. Unfortunately for Rick, the box was hardly authentic. According to the fan-favorite expert, the Beard of Knowledge, this particular item is one of the most widely faked ones out there. Rick should have known better too, especially since the seller had other clearly faked items with him. Like our entry above regarding Corey being swindled by fake Rolexes, this specific case regarding stolen diamonds wasn't something that transpired while Pawn Stars was on the air. But it's also worth bringing up, since the ones that got away with it will likely be telling their grandkids about that time they pulled the rug out from underneath the owners of the most famous pawn shop the world over. The most surprising part of this story is that it didn't happen to an inexperienced or the ever-befuddled Chumlee. No, it actually happened to the immensely knowledgeable and experienced Rick. This seller did a fantastic job in giving all the right answers to put Rick at ease and sucker him into a deal. and that's exactly what happened. Eventually, the police arrived to recover the goods, and Rick was out $40,000. Chumlee, maybe the most lucrative star of the show, and he's also very obviously the favorite cast member among fans. But he doesn't exactly have a good reputation when it comes to skills related to the pawn shop. A prime example of this was when Chumlee was suckered into a terribly bad deal that not only had him go over his reasonable purchase limit of $1,000, but also proved that he doesn't have that good an eye when it comes to spotting fakes. In short, a seller offered Chum a Gibson mandolin, and despite numerous red flags regarding its appearance, feel, and construction, the pawnbroker purchased it for $1,500. Sadly for good old Chum, the mandolin was a very poorly done fake, but the seller certainly loved his time in the spotlight since he got to make illicit cash and embarrass Chumlee in front of the world. At one point or another, we've all fantasized about digging through old boxes in our relatives' attics and then discovering some kind of insanely valuable object. Instead of it being a mere fantasy for this particular seller, it turned out to be an absolutely insane reality as he discovered a gold bar from a Spanish shipwreck. Already worth an immense amount in gold, the seller must be extremely happy that they were on Pawn Stars, since Rick's expert realized the value was even greater due to where the gold came from. What makes this even more amazing is that the seller was already fairly aware of the item's value, but instead of selling it right away, he waited for Rick's expert to appraise its true worth. Anyone who has watched at least one episode of Pawn Stars knows that musical instruments, typically guitars, are a major part of Rick's business in terms of both buying and selling. One particular seller aimed to sell an electric guitar allegedly owned by Jimi Hendrix. Rick was immediately enamored, and after having a buddy verify it, Rick tried to buy it for $600,000, but the seller refused. Sometime later, the very same guitar was being sold by the expert called to authenticate the item, suggesting that the expert later gave the seller what he wanted, all thanks to appearing on Pawn Stars. It's not unusual to see this kind of behavior when it comes to the buying and reselling of goods, but it must have hurt Rick to know that one of his trusted buddies ended up making a backdoor deal. Swords and weapons are a major fixture in the pawn shop, especially when it comes to the ornate, rare, and ancient. Knowing this, a seller had hoped to trade an exquisite samurai sword to the shop for impressive profits, but the so-called Pawn Stars themselves had other plans. While Rick and co. are usually fair, this time they were admittedly malicious in the scam they pulled on this unassuming seller. The sword sold for $1,500, but its valuation later on would prove it to be worth around 10 times more, which practically guaranteed that the seller felt crushing regret seep in and pollute the excitement he was feeling while watching himself on television. Not only did he miss out on an enormous amount of money, he also had his short time in the spotlight ruined. Bummer. Sports memorabilia is an enormous part of the pawn business, especially for Rick and his family, and this is evident on nearly every episode of Pawn Stars. Whether it's trophies, rings, bats, or even uniforms, there's often a huge and vastly lucrative market. Unfortunately for Corey, he paid a whopping $31,000 for what he believed to be a Willie Mays game-worn uniform, except it definitely wasn't. Not only was it not game-worn, but an authenticator later speculated that it never even belonged to the player in the first place. There's no doubt in our mind that the person who sold this jersey has no remorse about being on Pawn Stars and scamming them though, since they're $31,000 richer, and we can't really blame them for being happy about it. This ornate Order of the White Eagle medallion was found at a yard sale, where it was picked up for a mere 75 cents. Sometime later, the buyer decided to try his luck with Rick and the gang at their pawn shop, and was surprised to discover just how much value this particular medallion actually had. Not only was it practically untainted and in superior, nearly perfect shape, but it hailed from a tumultuous period in history, which helped give it a tremendous value, one that was far beyond the $3/4 it was initially picked up for. Sold for $6,000. We'd assume that the seller finally felt that their yard sale hobby was fully justified, and we can't blame them, especially when considering the massive profit margin from the deal. One of Rick's trustiest experts is Rebecca, who is the best of the best when it comes to accurately identifying and verifying the authenticity of all kinds of books, and she's used her skills to help the shop out countless times. When it came to this particular seller's 5th edition 1842 Book of Mormon, she was instrumental in making sure they got their money's worth from selling it to Rick. Appraised at $40,000 worth of value, Rick and the seller traded jabs until they met in the middle, agreeing on a cool $24,000 for the transaction. The next time you come across a 5th edition 1842 Book of Mormon, you better take good care of it, since it could make you as happy and rich as it did this seller. Just because something is rare or old, it doesn't necessarily mean it has monetary value. For something to be worth a ton of money, there needs to be a viable collector's market for whatever kind of item it is. And luckily for this particular seller, their Dutch East India Trading Company bell fit right into one. The seller herself thought the item might be worthless, going as far as to contemplate getting rid of it for cheap at a yard sale. And this thought was even corroborated by the old man. But an expert came in and changed everyone's tune, saying it was worth $15,000. Needless to say, this seller was more than pleased she decided to come to the shop with her bell, rather than put it out for a yard sale. One of baseball's all-time greatest stars, Shoeless Joe Jackson, is a favorite among high-paying collectors, especially when it comes to items with the illiterate player's autograph. Because of the mere possibility that this particular signature could end up being absolutely authentic, Rick threw caution to the wind and went against every last bit of sound advice against the purchase, even his own guts, and bought the item for $13,000. Turns out that his gut was right. The autograph was faked, and the unscrupulous seller made major bank. It's rare for Rick, of all people, to make a mistake as excruciating and devastating as this one. And we're sure he learned a major lesson from this less than stellar experience, particularly the value of his gut, which has been in the pawn business for years. When your item is one of the most iconic guns in the entirety of the world, there's always going to be some kind of value surrounding it for the right kind of collector. And Rick knows it, hence the pawn shop's massive selection of antique firearms. Rick saw dollar signs in his eyes when a seller brought in an engraved Wild West-era Colt 45 in outstanding condition and sprung at the chance to scoop it up. The value of the gun was estimated to be in the $8,500 range, and Rick being Rick offered the seller $3,000. But here's where the real sense of regret comes in. The seller admitted he only bought the gun for $25 and succumbed to the $3,000 offer despite being so low. Now the seller has to live with this shame for eternity, especially since the item is actually worth up to as much $42,000. Vic Flick is certainly a name that stands out, but a casual reader might not know the man behind the name or what makes him so famous. Vic is a British session guitarist, and his ultimate claim to fame is that he was the original player of the iconic James Bond theme. Rick and the seller wheeled and dealed until they came to an agreement. $60,000 for the cigar box. This is an insane amount of money for a mere cigar box, but considering the history regarding the object and the person who owned it, it's not hard to see where the value stemmed from. Gold has practically had value since the beginning of time. Now take the inherent adoration and monetary value of gold and couple it with the thriving scene of collectors who crave anything related to piracy, and you've got a match made in heaven. That's exactly what the seller of an inherited gold coin originally from a shipwreck found out when he visited the shop. Despite some misgivings from Rick regarding the authenticity of the piece, an expert soothed his concerns, and the seller was awarded with a massive reward for his efforts. Items like this are as rare and as valuable as ever, and we can only hope that this seller's joyous appearance on Pawn Stars keeps the market fresh for when we find our own gold coin. The New York Yankees were the World Series champions in 1951, and a seller was lucky enough to have a ball signed by that exceptional team. Hoping to make some serious cash, he brought his find to the pawn shop, only to find himself being offered a pathetic and insulting $800. Naturally, the seller turned this down, and it's a good thing he did, since the actual value of such a ball is in the $6,000 range. While he was unable to make a deal with the cast of Pawn Stars, there's a good that the exposure he received from appearing with the ball on the show allowed him to find a far less stingy buyer willing to offer the kind of cash that such a rare item deserves. Considered to be one of the greatest films ever made, it's no surprise that any memorabilia related to The Godfather would fetch an enormous price, especially when signatures are involved. That was the intention of this particular seller, at least, when she brought in her Godfather screenplay, signed by someone named Al. After an expert verified that the Al in question was none other than Al Pacino, the seller had more than enough fuel in her fire to turn down Rick's low offer. Instead, she turned to an auction and ended up receiving $12,000 for the script, likely thanks to her appearance on the show. The weirdest, best part though, the signature wasn't Pacino's after all, but the producer of the film, another Al.